the Riverfront Times. That's out today.
Yep.
Newsstands everywhere. And you know what? I'll buy it for you. So just go and get it, okay? That's how important this story is. Danny Wysentowski is our guest, and he wrote the cover story. You had a chance to, well, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
You sat down with Dorian Johnson.
Yes.
For an hour.
Yeah.
And had a one-on-one conversation with him.
Yeah, his lawyer was present, but it was about as one-on-one as you'll get.
And this is the first time he's really spoken to the media since early on, right?
Pretty much since late August, he had a lengthy conversation with the Washington Post. He got some media play during the grand jury where he was basically trotted out to ask him, like, how are you feeling?
Right.
But since then, he's pretty much lied low.
Dorian Johnson was the person walking with Michael Brown a year ago when Michael Brown was shot by Darren Wilson.
Yes.
Okay. Last we heard, Dorian Johnson was in New Orleans. Is that true?
They didn't tell me specific. They told me he was living with a family member
here in St. Louis.
In St. Louis.
Okay.
I've seen other reports where he's been living. Also, I know that he's not living in his own place. I did just see him post Facebook images of him next to the Michael Brown Memorial, so I'm inclined to believe he is still local. But I do know that he's going to be going to college out of state in the fall.
Gotcha. Tell us about the 1 hour conversation. Was he at peace? Was he full of anger? What was his state of mind?
I'd gone into the interview kind of asking to, kind of do a story that wasn't just going to rehash, kind of like, tell us again, what happened.
Mm-hmm.
That interview has been done so many times, and I had wanted to ask him sort of about how his life had changed and sort of the stresses of suddenly becoming this almost mythological villain to a lot of people, and a liar to a lot of people.
He's a mythological hero and a mythological villain all at the same time.
Yeah, no, it's clearly strange for him, and I think he was, kind of happy that he could sort of talk about something else besides those 2 minutes, that everyone wants to know about. And I think there was a lot of bitterness that came out in the interview of sort of watching how his own testimony has been picked apart and used and discarded, and then of course watching the grand jury come back with a non-indictment. I think was very hurtful for him to see.
Does he still stand by his story that Michael Brown's hands were up and don't shoot?
Yeah, I mean he's still very adamant that Michael Brown was murdered on the street, that that Darren Wilson was the aggressor in that initial confrontation. He's gone back on one significant statement, which was that first statement he made, I believe, in those first interviews, that Brown was shot in the back. And in a later interview in the grand jury, they sort of questioned him, saying, "Did you actually see him get shot? Did you see, blood or his shirt torn?" He said, "No, I saw the gun. I heard the gunshot, and I saw Michael Brown like jerk and turn around, and so I thought, he kind of just put two actions back to back, and that was something other witnesses did as well. Mm-hmm. Other witnesses said that he was shot in the leg, but for a similar reason, that there was, two instances happening at the same moment."
Yeah, the federal grand jury, the federal Justice Department came out and said that there's no evidence that hands up, don't shoot didn't happen. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Washington Post, and you mentioned in your story Jonathan Capehart, who was a sympathetic talking head nationally to Dorian Johnson and to Michael Brown, wrote a story in the Washington Post saying, boy, it was a lie, and my heart's breaking because what I believed happened and what I thought happened didn't happen based on what Dorian Johnson was exposed to not telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. I think in a very real sense that the idea that the Department of Justice report disproved Dorian Johnson or vindicated Wilson is actually not true. The Department of Justice report was trying to evaluate if this were a civil rights case, if we were going to bring this saying that Michael Brown had his civil rights violated, could we use these witnesses? How good would they be on the stand? And so when they're evaluating these witnesses, they're not actually, matching one piece of physical evidence to another thing they said. They might say this, one witness had a brother who had a bad run-in with the cops. That witness is going to be probably impeached on the stand. We wouldn't want to use those. Now, they do talk about Dorian Johnson's testimony in that his statements that, Michael Brown never punched Darren Wilson through the window. We think that we have DNA of Michael Brown inside the car. That's a big point of contention, but the witness statements are so mutually contradictory. For every witnesses that all said Michael Brown charged, there are similar witnesses who say there were 3 police officers.
Right, no, I understand that, but if Michael Brown's DNA is in the car, and on the officer, and Dorian Johnson says that never happened. Well, who do you believe? Do you believe the science, or do you believe the eyewitness?
Well, there are two big questions that the science actually doesn't answer, and that's how did the initial confrontation happen? Meaning, did Wilson slam his door into Michael Brown, or did Michael Brown grab the door and slam it into Wilson? There's conflicting accounts, and this was sort of a chaotic moment. The other big question is, and those last shots when Darren Wilson is 30 or so feet away from Michael Brown, is Michael Brown charging? Those witness statements are very all across the board, from he's standing to he's charging to he's leaning forward. And so we don't get a clear sense of what is actually happening. We know how many bullets hit him. We know where the blood is. But those last moments where, is Darren Wilson afraid for his life? Where's Michael Brown moving? There's a lot of doubt.
In the, and I forget which one, it might have been the Robert McCullough grand jury, it comes out that Dorian Johnson runs in and changes his clothes and runs back out, which has never really been explained as to why you've just seen your friend shot and killed, and the first thing you do is run into your house, change your clothes, and run back out.
What he told me was that he was afraid of the police. He thought that, he thought, and I guess the way he presented it to me was he just saw his friend murdered by a police officer, and he wasn't sure if he was going to be next. And I think, if you're talking to, any kind of petty criminal, if you think that you need to get away from the cops, and I'm not necessarily Dorian Johnson as a petty criminal, but he's a guy who knows if you got to escape from police attention, it's a good idea to change your clothes. And he actually went into hiding immediately after that because he was afraid of what police or vigilantes, but mostly police, would do to him.
Right. But in terms of innocence or guilt, you go and you change your clothes. It doesn't look like the actions of an innocent person. Yeah,
I don't think he was thinking with a mindset of, am I going to prove my innocence in this or not? From what he told me, this was just incredible amounts of fear and trauma of, really just seeing someone die.
Dan Wiskentowski is with us. Riverfront Times reporter wrote a cover story. It's in newsstands everywhere about Dorian Johnson. You sat down with him for an hour. In this story, you talk about, is it his younger brother who goes to the University of Maryland?
Yes, DeMonte.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, too, because it seems like two brothers headed in two different directions.
Yeah, it's very much that case, and that was sort of the way they presented it to me, is that DeMonte sort of had some godparents that he was able to live with, in St. Louis County. He was out of, his sort of family's sort of inner city St. Louis home a lot, and he was able to avoid a lot of the street issues and a lot of the, kind of the challenges that Dorian ran into. They're also just two different people. DeMonte is kind of this naturally academically gifted person, and I think both of them kind of acknowledge that.
His brother went to Chaminade?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then ended up going to the University of Maryland.
Yeah, and as like I described in the story, their youngest brother died in a drag racing accident, and that kind of brought both of their lives into a significant tension. DeMonte, came back from school in Maryland. He couldn't handle the grief, and both of them kind of their relationship kind of broke down until they were kind of found themselves in a cell after they were arrested in May.
He's suing Ferguson.
Yes, he's suing Ferguson, he's suing Darren Wilson, and he's suing former Ferguson Police Chief Thomas Jackson. What
is he suing them for?
A variety of lawsuit-sounding things like psychological damage, loss of work, assorted expenses. A lot of it is just initial lawsuit filings. It's hard to say exactly, but the lawsuit, as is with the Michael Brown's family lawsuit, really relies on Dorian Johnson's testimony, where they're making a case that Darren Wilson only stopped them because he was a racist, and that Dorian Johnson was the aggressor.
That's a pretty tough charge to prove.
But that's the charge that was not that the Department of Justice was not able to prove. That civil rights thing.
Well, it's impossible, and I know you're just the reporter telling his side of the story, but it's almost impossible to tell or to prove somebody walking down the street is a racist.
Yeah, and I think that might speak something more to the way the law is constructed, or the way the difficulty in figuring out the motivations of anyone's mindset, and especially of police.
Right. Not to mention, we know that he robbed the convenience store.
We know Michael Brown robbed the convenience store.
With Dorian Johnson there.
Well, he was there.
He was there, right. And we also know that Darren Wilson knew that he was looking for two suspects who looked like them who had just robbed a convenience store.
You know, if you'd asked me this question on August 13th, I would have said the exact opposite, because Ferguson Police Chief Thomas Jackson said that Darren Wilson didn't have the information on the robbery.
That's right, but we now know that he did.
You know, that item has flipped probably 2 or 3 times. I acknowledge it's in the grand jury. Other witnesses who spoke on Darren Wilson's behalf said that he knew about it, and yet there are other witnesses in the Ferguson Police Department who said that he didn't. And it's one of those points where, you know, I can look in the grand jury and I can say, all right, I think we know how this event happened. We know Darren Wilson had these thoughts in his head. It really sticks in my mind, though, of how strange that detail kind of fell in. And it's so crucial. You know, did he know about the robbery or not? And that's something that has never, at least to my mind as a reporter, that I've never felt fully comfortable with.
So he stops them, says, get out of the street. They make a snide comment. He then drives away, finds out that, hey, the convenience store was just robbed, 2 suspects, here's what they're wearing. And he's like, wait a minute, those are the 2 guys. Puts it in reverse.
Yeah.
And then says, wait a minute, I just told those 2 guys to get out from the middle of the street.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much ironclad facts, is it not?
It is, because, we have Darren Wilson telling us this. We have police testimony. I think just the inconsistency in the initial reporting, a very simple fact. Did the officer know if the individuals were suspected in a crime? That is not a detail that police usually get wrong, especially not get wrong multiple times.
Right.
And so you're right, and that's the way he said it, and that does kind of, it does create sort of this logical consistency. He sees them. He has a reason to stop them. Yeah. He's not just harassing guys in the street. But if you ask Dorian Johnson, it happened a much different way, and there are witnesses who fall into either camp.
Yeah. So where does he go from here? What is he going to do now?
I don't think he really knows. He wants to go. He's going to college out of state, starting in the fall, is what he tells me. I think he's a guy who kind of fell out of school a few years back, and another, he had a criminal history a little bit and getting tossed out for, allegedly stealing a backpack and giving a false report. And I think, since then he's been trying to figure out, like any, young 20-something who's trying to figure their life out, what he wants to do. And I think he's still just trying to figure out, when is his feet going to touch the ground after all of this.
Yeah, interesting stuff. But he was there with his lawyers.
One lawyer with me.
Who was the lawyer?
James Williams.
James Williams.
Not Bosley.
Not Bosley. Okay, because Bosley was his initial attorney.
Yeah, and Williams and Bosley, they were either one or the other one, or both, in a couple interviews, would always be there with Dorian during the interviews.
It's interesting because you write in the story, Dan Wiskentowski is our guest, Riverfront Times reporter, cover story, sat down with Dorian Johnson. Early on, he reaches out to Adolphus Pruitt, who's head of the NAACP in the city, I believe. And they parade him around to MSNBC, CNN, anybody who will talk to him. He becomes a giant talking head. And he gets, I know this because I was there with them. I saw the limos and the cars as they drove him to and from the appearances with all these national outlets telling the story to Lawrence O'Donnell and CNN and Hands Up, Don't Shoot and Shot in the Back and all these things. And then when the story started to unravel, you didn't hear anything from him.
Well, I think you saw a lot of interviews. The news about the robbery at the Ferguson Market, and then his former criminal history. I mean, he did a good amount of interviews in that next week where he got pretty hammered, by other people, especially like Don Lemon that I mentioned in the story, who asked, isn't that lying? Isn't that lying by omission? Right. I think that that's something that he had to reckon with. But I also think it's always kind of discomforting a little bit to see, a giant media circus. You always wonder what's going on behind it and who's getting what. Right. But I think, in this case, it was significant that we had this witness who was who was there, who was providing sort of this immediate counterbalance to the police narrative. And usually we only get one or the other. Right. And so I think, we can look at it now and feel like, yeah, that was a bit much. Yeah. But I mean, we were able to get a fullness of the story that I don't think we would have had otherwise without what Dorian Johnson was doing at the time.
Danny Wiskentowski, Riverfront Times reporter, cover story, sat down with Dorian Johnson, one of the few people who were there when it happened. Whether you agree with him, believe him, don't believe parts of it, that's the story. Danny, thanks for coming in.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
You got it. 9:38 here, Big 550.